The moment I told Mark I was leaving felt like a thunderclap in the stillness of our home. A decision that echoed with years of pain and unspoken struggles. His response, cold and dismissive, was all too familiar. "Stop acting like a victim." But this time I wouldn't let his words silence me. I was ready to reclaim my voice and my life, taking with me the one thing he never expected: my dignity. Before I dive deeper into this journey of self-discovery and empowerment, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where are you listening from? And if you resonate with my story, consider subscribing. Your support gives me the strength to share my truth. Now let's get into the heart of my story. The argument with Mark had started like any other. Small frustrations bubbling beneath the surface, words exchanged in tones too sharp for comfort. But this time his response cut deeper than usual. "Stop acting like a victim," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. Those words hung in the room, heavy and suffocating, erasing any space for my feelings, my pain. In that moment, the fragile illusion of our marriage shattered completely. I realized that no matter how much I tried to communicate, he would never see me, not really. I sat there, stunned by the harshness of his words, feeling the weight of all the times I had been gaslit, the times my emotions were brushed aside as overreactions. His dismissal wasn't just about that argument, it was a pattern, a constant refrain that made me doubt myself, my worth, my reality. The man I had married, the one I had trusted with my heart, had become a stranger who refused to acknowledge my pain. I am Emma, in my early 40s, and for years I believed I was building a life with Mark. From the outside, our marriage looked stable, two people navigating the ups and downs of life together. But inside, the constant emotional neglect and blame had worn me down. Mark's charm masked a deeper unwillingness to listen, to empathize. Whenever I expressed my struggles or vulnerability, he dismissed them, telling me I was too sensitive or making a big deal out of nothing. That night, after his words echoed in my mind, I felt a surge of clarity I hadn't had before. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending that things would get better if I just tried harder to be the wife he wanted. His refusal to even acknowledge my feelings wasn't just hurtful. It was a sign that nothing would change unless I took control of my own destiny. I remember the quiet that followed his outburst, the silence filled with unspoken pain and broken promises. Mark retreated to the other room, indifferent to the storm inside me. I sat alone in the dim light of our living room, my heart aching but my resolve strengthening. I knew this was the breaking point. The days that followed were a blur of careful planning and guarded hope. I began to quietly gather my strength, my resources, and my courage. Every small step was a rebellion against the life that had slowly suffocated me. I started to think about what freedom might look like, what it would mean to reclaim my dignity and my voice. Mark, oblivious to the transformation taking place within me, carried on as if nothing had changed. He continued to dismiss my concerns, to belittle my feelings, to insist that I was the problem. But beneath my calm exterior, I was already mapping out a path away from the pain. I found myself searching for stories of women who broke free, who chose themselves over the toxic relationships that tried to keep them chained. Their journeys inspired me, reminding me that I was not alone and that change was possible. I began to believe in a future where I could be seen, heard, and valued. Late at night, I would sit by the window, imagining a life beyond the confines of our strained marriage. I pictured a place where I could breathe without fear, where my laughter wasn't met with sarcasm or disdain. These dreams fueled my determination, turning despair into quiet hope. I started to make practical moves too, opening a separate bank account in secret, saving what little I could from my paycheck. I gathered important documents and kept them hidden, preparing for the day when I would finally step out from the shadow Mark cast over my life. Each action, though small, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Despite the growing distance between us, I maintained the facade of normalcy during the day. I played the role of the supportive wife, smiling and nodding through conversations, all the while my mind was elsewhere, focused on freedom, on survival. The contrast between the life I lived with Mark and the life I was planning for myself grew sharper every day. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Mark once again dismissed my feelings as weakness, I found myself retreating to the quiet of our bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, tears slipping silently down my cheeks, mourning the loss of the marriage I thought I had. But even in that sadness, there was a flicker of resolve. I was done being invisible. I realized that staying meant more pain, more erosion of my self-worth. Leaving was terrifying, uncertain, and fraught with challenges, but it was the only way forward. The words Mark had thrown at me were meant to break me, but instead they ignited a fire I didn't know I had. From that night on, I made a silent promise to myself. I would no longer let Mark's voice define my reality. I would no longer be the woman who shrank to fit the limits he imposed. I would fight to reclaim my life piece by piece until I was whole again. The path ahead was unclear, and fear lurked around every corner. But beneath it all, a newfound strength was taking root. I was beginning to understand that my worth was not dependent on Mark's approval, nor was my happiness tied to his willingness to change. In the quiet moments before sleep, I whispered to myself that I deserved respect, love, and kindness, things that had been absent for far too long. I envisioned the day when I would walk away from this pain, not as a defeated woman, but as one reborn. Mark's harsh words had been the catalyst, the breaking point that shattered the illusion of our marriage and set me on a path to freedom. And though the road ahead would be difficult, I was ready to face it, fueled by the fierce determination to reclaim my dignity and my life. I am Emma, and for years, I painted a picture of my marriage with Mark as a story of shared dreams and quiet companionship. From the outside, our life appeared steady. Two people navigating the routines of daily existence, balancing careers, friends, and family responsibilities. But beneath that surface, the reality was far more complicated, tangled in emotional neglect and unspoken resentments that slowly eroded the foundation we were supposed to build together. Mark was a man who could be charming and attentive when it suited him. His laughter could fill a room, and his smile could disarm even the most stubborn disagreements. Yet behind that charm was a relentless pattern of dismissal and blame that chipped away at my sense of self. He often insisted I was too sensitive, that I overreacted, or that I was making mountains out of molehills whenever I tried to share my feelings or express my struggles. It was as if my emotions were a problem that needed fixing rather than a call for connection. I tried to convince myself that this was just how our relationship worked, that love sometimes meant weathering storms without complaint, that compromise required silence at times. I held on to the hope that Mark's moments of kindness and affection were the true measure of our bond, that the dismissals were just passing shadows. But over time, those shadows grew longer and darker. The emotional neglect wasn't always blatant. It was often subtle. A look that didn't meet mine, a sigh when I spoke about my day, a quick dismissal of my worries with a sarcastic remark. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, second-guessing whether I was valid in my feelings or simply too much for him to handle. I found myself shrinking, retreating into silence to avoid triggering his impatience. Mark's insistence that I was overreacting became a mantra that echoed in my mind, twisting my perception of reality. I began to doubt my own experience, wondering if I was imagining the coldness, the indifference. But deep down I knew the truth. I was hurting, and the person I loved was refusing to see it. There were times when I confronted him gently, trying to bridge the widening gap between us. I'd say, "I feel unheard," or "It hurts when you dismiss my feelings." Each time his response was a brush-off, sometimes with a hint of annoyance. "You need to toughen up," he'd say. "Life isn't about feelings all the time." His words made me feel small, like my pain was an inconvenience rather than a real part of our shared life. The weight of this emotional neglect became a constant ache in my chest. I found myself longing for connection and understanding, but those moments were rare and fleeting. Instead, I was met with blame whenever I tried to express vulnerability. It was as if Mark's love came with a price: silence, compliance, and the erasure of my own needs. I remember the nights lying awake beside him, feeling the cold distance between us like a physical barrier. I would reach out, hoping for warmth or reassurance, only to be met with indifference or irritation. The man I had married, the one I once thought would be my partner through life's challenges, seemed increasingly unreachable. At social gatherings, Mark's charm still shone. He was witty and engaging, the center of attention, effortlessly commanding the room. But when we returned home, the mask would slip, and the dismissiveness would return. I often wondered if he saw me at all, or if I had become invisible in the shadow of his ego. Over time, the emotional toll seeped into every corner of my life. I felt exhausted, depleted by the constant effort to maintain a facade of harmony. My confidence waned, replaced by a creeping sense of unworthiness. Was I too sensitive? Was I the problem? These questions haunted me, eroding my spirit. Yet, despite the pain, I clung to the hope that things could change. I remembered the early days of our relationship, when Mark's eyes held kindness and his touch was gentle. I believed that beneath the layers of neglect was the man I loved, waiting to return. This hope kept me tethered. Even as the emotional distance widened, I blamed myself for the cracks in our marriage, thinking that if I were different, less demanding, more patient, quieter, Mark would be the partner I needed. I silenced my own voice to avoid conflict, suppressed my desires to avoid disappointment. But silence only deepened the chasm between us. Friends and family noticed the strain. Some offered gentle advice. Others expressed concern. But I was reluctant to reveal the truth. How could I explain that the man who seemed so perfect to the world was the source of my loneliness? I feared judgment and misunderstanding, so I kept the pain hidden behind polite smiles and rehearsed stories. The emotional neglect affected my work and friendships too. I found myself withdrawing, hesitant to share my true feelings for fear of being dismissed or misunderstood. The woman who once thrived on connection was retreating into isolation, a shell hardened by years of emotional bruising. Yet, even in the darkest moments, a small part of me refused to be extinguished. I began to recognize the pattern of neglect for what it was, a barrier to the love and respect I deserved. I started to question the narrative Mark had imposed on me, the story that I was the problem, the one who needed to change. I sought out books and articles about emotional abuse and neglect, finding solace in the experiences of others who had walked similar paths. Their stories resonated deeply, shining a light on my own pain and validating my feelings. I realized that Mark's dismissal was not a reflection of my worth but of his inability or unwillingness to truly see me. This awakening was both painful and empowering. It forced me to confront the reality that our marriage was not the partnership I had dreamed of. The man I loved was not the man I needed, and staying silent was slowly destroying me. I began to understand that emotional neglect is a form of erasure, one that leaves the victim feeling invisible, unheard, and unimportant. It's a slow, insidious form of cruelty that often goes unnoticed by the world but devastates the soul. As I peeled back the layers of my own pain, I started to reclaim my identity outside of Mark's shadow. I remembered the woman I used to be, the one who laughed freely, dreamed boldly, and believed in her own strength. That woman was still inside me, waiting to be awakened. Mark's charm and insistence that I was too sensitive had masked a deeper truth, that our marriage was built on uneven ground, where my feelings were dismissed and my needs ignored. Recognizing this was the first step toward reclaiming my life. Though the journey ahead was uncertain, I began to feel a flicker of hope. I was no longer willing to accept neglect as a normal part of love. I deserved better respect, empathy, and partnership. In the quiet moments between pain and hope, I made a silent vow to myself, to listen to my own voice, to honor my feelings, and to seek a life where I could be truly seen and valued. The path would not be easy, but it was necessary. Mark's dismissal had left a wound, but it also ignited a spark, a beginning of self-discovery and the courage to face the truth. I was ready to step out of the shadow of neglect and into the light of my own strength. I still remember the day I finally confronted Mark about how his dismissive attitude was tearing me apart. It had been building inside me for months, the frustration, the loneliness, the aching need to be seen and heard. That evening I gathered every ounce of courage and sat him down, determined to break through the wall of indifference that had come between us. Mark, I began, my voice trembling but clear. I need you to understand how your words and actions affect me. When you dismiss my feelings, it hurts. I feel invisible, like what I'm going through doesn't matter to you. He looked at me, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Emma, you need to toughen up, he said, his tone sharp. Life isn't about feelings all the time. You're making things worse by playing the victim. You need to stop overreacting and start dealing with reality. His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had hoped for empathy, for a willingness to listen, but instead I was met with cold dismissal and blame. The man I had trusted to be my partner, my confidant, was telling me that my pain was my fault, that I was weak for feeling it at all. I tried to explain, this isn't about being weak, Mark. It's about feeling respected and valued. I'm not asking for much, just for you to see me, to acknowledge that I'm struggling. But he shook his head, folding his arms defensively. "You're too sensitive. You always have been. Maybe if you stopped focusing on your feelings so much, you'd be happier. I'm not going to change who I am for you." That was the moment I realized that no matter how much I tried, Mark wasn't going to meet me halfway. His refusal to acknowledge my perspective wasn't just stubbornness. It was a refusal to validate my experience. It was a rejection of the very essence of who I was. The confrontation didn't end with resolution. It spiraled into frustration and silence. I sat there feeling more alone than ever, the gulf between us widening into an unbridgeable chasm. His words echoed in my mind, reinforcing the narrative I had been fighting against, that I was the problem, that I was too much. But beneath the hurt, a new clarity began to emerge. I understood that this was not a momentary disagreement but a pattern, a fundamental incompatibility in how we related to each other. Mark's insistence that I toughen up was not encouragement. It was a dismissal of my humanity. In the days that followed, I replayed the conversation over and over, trying to make sense of it. I felt a mix of sorrow and anger. Sorrow for the man I thought I knew, anger at the way he refused to see me. The confrontation had cracked the fragile facade of our marriage, exposing the raw wounds beneath. I found myself questioning everything I had believed about us. Was love supposed to feel like this, like walking on glass, afraid to express pain for fear of ridicule? Was partnership meant to be this one-sided, where one person's needs were ignored or invalidated? Mark's cold dismissal forced me to confront a painful truth. I was trapped in a relationship where my feelings were not just overlooked but actively rejected. His words weren't just hurtful. They were a barrier to any real connection or healing. Yet, amid the devastation, a small seed of resolve took root. I realized that I could no longer silence my own voice to preserve a marriage that denied my existence. The confrontation, painful as it was, became a catalyst for change. It shattered the illusion that things could go back to the way they were. I began to see that Mark's refusal to understand me was not a failing on my part but a reflection of his own limitations. His inability to empathize was a sign that our marriage was built on uneven ground, where my needs were secondary to his comfort. The conversation haunted me, but it also galvanized me. I knew I couldn't continue living in the shadow of that dismissal. I needed to reclaim my voice and my worth, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. In the quiet moments after our argument, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the pain I had been carrying. I cried for the loss of the marriage I had hoped for the love that had turned cold. But I also felt a growing fire within, a determination to no longer accept neglect as my lot. Mark's words had been intended to break me, to force me into submission. Instead, they awakened a fierce clarity. I understood that staying silent was a form of self-betrayal, and speaking up, even in the face of rejection, was an act of courage. The confrontation also revealed how deeply isolated I had become. Mark's refusal to listen was a reminder that I couldn't rely on him for the emotional support I needed. I would have to find strength elsewhere, within myself and among those who truly saw me. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. I was stepping into unfamiliar territory, where the familiar walls of my marriage no longer offered safety. But within that uncertainty was the possibility of freedom, the chance to heal and to build a life where my feelings mattered. In the weeks that followed, I began to distance myself emotionally, creating a quiet space to reflect and gather strength. I maintained the routines of daily life, but inside I was no longer willing to be diminished. The confrontation with Mark had marked a turning point, the first real crack in the foundation of our relationship. I started to recognize the patterns of dismissal and blame for what they were, signs of a relationship that no longer served me. The man I loved was still there, but the marriage we had was unraveling beneath the weight of unspoken resentments and unmet needs. Despite the pain, I felt a flicker of hope. The confrontation, as harsh as it had been, was a wake-up call, a moment of truth that propelled me toward reclaiming my life. I knew the journey ahead would be difficult, filled with uncertainty and heartache, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my sense of self. Mark's failure to understand me was a painful revelation, but it also opened the door to my own awakening. I began to see that true connection required mutual respect and empathy, things that had been missing for far too long. As I stood at this crossroads, I felt a mix of fear and resolve. The confrontation had stripped away the illusions, exposing the reality I needed to face. I was ready to step into the unknown, to seek a life where my voice could be heard and my worth recognized. That evening, as I lay awake in the silence of our home, I whispered to myself that I deserved better, that I was more than the dismissals and accusations. Mark's words had tried to silence me, but they had only strengthened my resolve. I was beginning to understand that sometimes the hardest confrontations are the ones that set us free. The conversation with Mark had been painful, but it was also the first step toward reclaiming my autonomy and my dignity. After that painful confrontation with Mark, I felt a quiet resolve settling deep within me. The words he had hurled, telling me to toughen up, to stop playing the victim, had been a brutal wake-up call. But instead of breaking me, they sparked a determination to take back control of my life, to no longer be silenced or diminished by his dismissiveness. I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't keep living in a marriage where my feelings were so thoroughly disregarded. So I began making secret preparations to leave, small steps that I carefully concealed beneath the routine of our daily life. During the day, I maintained the facade of normalcy, smiling when Mark spoke, nodding through the conversations, hiding the storm of emotions inside. But at night, when the house was quiet, I worked silently toward my future. I started by opening a separate bank account, something I had never done before. It was a small victory to know that, no matter what happened, I would have some financial independence. Every paycheck, I tucked away a portion, no matter how little, into this hidden reserve. I balanced bills and expenses carefully, cutting down on unnecessary spending, all while making sure Mark never suspected a thing. Gathering important documents became another secret ritual. Birth certificates, insurance papers, tax records, all stored in a small box hidden beneath my bed. I wanted to be prepared for any eventuality, to have the tools I needed when the time came to walk away. It felt empowering, this quiet act of reclaiming control over my own life. I spent hours reading stories online. Women who had broken free from toxic relationships, who had found strength and happiness after years of pain. Their journeys resonated deeply with me, lighting a path through the darkness I had been wandering. I wasn't alone. Others had faced similar struggles and emerged on the other side, stronger and freer. One story in particular stayed with me. A woman who described her first taste of freedom as both terrifying and exhilarating. She spoke of the courage it took to say no more, to choose herself despite the fear. Her words gave me permission to hope, to believe that I could find my own way out of this suffocating marriage. I also began to quietly reach out to old friends, those I hadn't spoken to in a long time. I kept the conversations light, careful not to reveal too much, but simply reconnecting reminded me of who I was outside of Mark's shadow. Their warmth and support, even in small doses, became a lifeline. At work, I took on extra hours whenever possible, determined to build up my savings faster. It was exhausting, juggling long days and emotional turmoil, but each dollar saved felt like a brick in the foundation of my new life. I was planting seeds for a future where I could stand on my own 2 feet. Despite these secret preparations, living with Mark grew increasingly difficult. His frustration with my quiet withdrawal was palpable, though he never asked directly what was wrong. I could see the impatience in his eyes when I declined social invitations or seemed distant. But I kept my plans to myself, knowing that revealing them too soon would only lead to conflict. At times, I felt caught between two worlds, the life I was preparing to leave behind and the uncertain future I was building in secret. The tension was exhausting, and the fear of discovery loomed over me like a shadow. But with every step, I felt a little more in control, a little more hopeful. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Mark dismissed my concerns about our relationship, I retreated to the sanctuary of my bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pulled out my journal. Another secret project I had started to help process my feelings. Writing gave me a voice when speaking aloud felt too risky. I wrote about the loneliness, the hurt, and the flicker of hope that was growing inside me. I wrote about the courage it took to plan an escape, to imagine a life where I could be free. Each word was a small act of rebellion against the silence Mark demanded. As days turned into weeks, my resolve only strengthened. I visualized the moment I would finally leave, the moment I would close the door behind me and step into a life of my own making. It was a distant dream, but it fueled me through the hardest days. I also found myself becoming more discerning with my emotions. I no longer allowed Mark's dismissive remarks to erode my self-worth as deeply. I practiced setting mental boundaries, reminding myself that his refusal to understand was not a reflection of my value. There were moments of doubt and fear, of course. Some nights, the weight of uncertainty pressed so heavily that I questioned whether I was strong enough to follow through. But then I remembered the stories of other women, the quiet strength I was discovering within myself, and I pushed forward. I started researching places where I might live, small apartments or studios that felt safe and affordable. I imagined turning those spaces into sanctuaries where I could heal and rebuild. The idea of having a place to call my own, free from judgment and neglect, was a beacon of hope. Throughout it all, I kept up appearances during the day. I smiled at Mark, made polite conversation, and played the part of the supportive wife. Inside, though, I was building a new life one brick at a time, one secret step after another. One afternoon, I came across a quote that resonated deeply. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. For so long, I had been stuck in the paralysis of fear and doubt. Now I was finally moving forward, no matter how small the steps. I realized that my quiet preparations were more than just logistics. They were acts of self-love and defiance. Each secret saved dollar, every hidden document, every whispered hope was a declaration that I mattered, that my happiness was worth fighting for. Mark remained unaware of the transformation unfolding beneath his nose. He continued to dismiss my feelings, to blame me for perceived shortcomings, all while I quietly gathered the strength to break free. I knew that when the time came I would have to face confrontation again, but this time I would be armed with more than just hope. I would have a plan, a safety net, and the courage born from months of preparation. For now, I held on to that quiet resolve, nurturing it in the shadows. It was the ember that would one day ignite into a flame, lighting the way out of the darkness and into a future defined by my own terms. I was no longer willing to be silenced or diminished. I was ready to claim my voice, my dignity, and my life. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I was prepared to walk it, step by careful step, toward the freedom I deserved. One afternoon, while scrolling through listings on a real estate site, I stumbled upon a small apartment downtown that immediately caught my eye. It was modest, a cozy studio with soft light streaming through large windows, tucked into a quiet neighborhood that felt worlds away from the heaviness of my current life. Something about that little space stirred a flicker of hope inside me, a whisper of possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could start over. I didn't tell Mark about it. Instead, I began visiting the apartment under the pretense of late work meetings or extra shifts. Spending a few hours there, away from the tension and dismissiveness at home, brought a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The quiet hum of the city, the fresh air filtering through the open windows, it was a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without fear of judgment or neglect. At first, I visited only on weekends, but gradually the visits became more frequent. I'd tell Mark I was working late or catching up on projects, while secretly savoring those stolen moments of freedom. The apartment became my refuge, a physical space where I could reclaim my identity and gather strength. I began to imagine what it would be like to truly live there, to fill the empty rooms with my own belongings, colors, and warmth. The thought filled me with a cautious excitement, a promise of a future where I could be myself without compromise. During this time, I reconnected with Mia, an old friend from college who had always been a source of support and encouragement. Meeting her again reminded me of my own resilience and worth. Mia's stories of her own struggles and triumphs inspired me to invest in myself, to believe that happiness was not only possible, but within reach. Our conversations were a balm to my weary soul. She listened without judgment, offered advice, and reminded me that I deserved to be loved and respected. Her friendship became a vital anchor as I navigated the uncertainty of my secret plans. Back at the apartment, I started small projects, painting a wall, arranging furniture, even planting a few flowers on the windowsill. Each act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been lost in the shadows of my marriage. The space became more than just a shelter. It became a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Meanwhile, life with Mark remained strained. He noticed my growing distance but never asked directly. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, manifesting in sharp comments and cold silences. I learned to navigate our interactions carefully, protecting my fragile hope while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. I was living two lives, the one with Mark, filled with tension and dismissal, and the one in my quiet apartment, filled with dreams and quiet strength. The contrast was stark, but it fueled my determination to keep moving forward. One evening, after a particularly tense exchange with Mark, I retreated to my sanctuary. Sitting on the floor of the empty apartment, I allowed myself to cry, not out of weakness but from the release of years of pent-up pain. The apartment absorbed my tears and held my silent promises of freedom. I realized that this small space, this modest apartment, was becoming my lifeline. It was where I could gather the courage to face whatever came next, a place where I could rebuild without fear of dismissal or blame. The more time I spent there, the more I felt the stirrings of empowerment. I began researching everything I could about renting, budgeting, and eventually buying a place of my own. The logistics felt daunting, but the thought of owning a home where I could set my own rules was exhilarating. I took on extra shifts at work, saving every spare dollar. I cut back on unnecessary expenses, mindful of the future I was building. Each deposit into my secret savings account felt like a step closer to freedom. In this new space, I rediscovered parts of myself I had long forgotten. The woman who dreamed, who hoped, who believed in her own strength. The apartment was not just a physical refuge. It was a sanctuary for my soul. I also found solace in small routines. Morning coffee by the window, journaling about my hopes, and listening to music that made me feel alive. These moments of self-care were revolutionary for someone who had spent so long suppressing her own needs. As weeks passed, the apartment became a tangible representation of my quiet rebellion against the life Mark imposed on me. It was a statement that I was no longer willing to accept neglect or invisibility. Yet I remained cautious. I knew that revealing this new chapter to Mark would be difficult, and so I kept my plans close, sharing only with trusted friends like Mia. Their encouragement bolstered my resolve, reminding me that I was not alone. The apartment also became a place of discovery. I met neighbors, people with their own stories of resilience and hope. Their kindness and openness reminded me of the community I had been missing, and I began to feel a sense of belonging outside of my marriage. One neighbor, Jake, a local handyman, caught my attention. Our brief conversations were easy and genuine, a welcome contrast to the strained interactions at home. His presence was comforting, a reminder that connection was still possible. Though I was careful to keep these new relationships separate from my life with Mark, they gave me glimpses of a future filled with support and understanding. As I stood by the window one morning watching the city wake up, I felt a fragile but growing hope. The apartment was more than a place to hide. It was a beacon of possibility. It was where my new life was beginning to take shape. I knew the journey ahead would be challenging. The tension with Mark was unlikely to ease, and the decision to leave would come with its own set of trials. But in this small, quiet space I felt ready. Ready to reclaim my voice. Ready to embrace my independence. Ready to build a life where I could finally be free. The apartment was my sanctuary, my symbol of hope, and my first real step toward the future I deserved. The more time I spent at the apartment, the clearer it became that my growing sense of independence was stirring something in Mark. A restless frustration that simmered just beneath his carefully controlled exterior. At home, the atmosphere shifted palpably. His patience thinned. His once subtle dismissals edged into sharper, more pointed remarks. The tension between us grew like a taut wire, ready to snap. One evening, I overheard him muttering under his breath after I declined an invitation to a dinner party with his colleagues. "Always retreating," he said, his voice heavy with contempt. "She's changed. Not the woman I married." The sting of those words cut deeper than he could have imagined. It was as if my very existence outside of his sphere threatened his control. I noticed how he began to criticize my choices more openly. The way I dressed, how I spent my time, even the new friends I was making. His comments were laced with sarcasm, designed to belittle and undermine. "So you think hanging out with that neighbor of yours is going to make a difference?" he sneered one night, his eyes narrowed. "You're chasing fantasies, Emma." His attempts to belittle my feelings became more frequent and aggressive. When I tried to express excitement about the apartment or the future I was quietly building, he would dismiss me with a scoff or a cutting remark. "You're living in a dream world," he'd say. "You'll come back when reality hits." I felt a mix of fear and defiance. Fear because his growing hostility made the home I once sought comfort in feel cold and unwelcoming. Defiance because, despite his efforts, I refused to let his words diminish the hope and strength I was nurturing within myself. Mark's frustration was a clear sign that my quiet rebellion was not going unnoticed. I had started setting boundaries, asserting my needs in small ways, and that was unsettling to him. Where once I was compliant and silent, I was now carving out space for myself, refusing to be overshadowed. At times, his anger felt suffocating. One evening, after a heated exchange where he accused me of neglecting our marriage, I retreated to the apartment, my sanctuary. There, surrounded by the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the window, I allowed myself to breathe. The contrast between the tension at home and the peace in that small space was stark. In those quiet moments, I wrestled with conflicting emotions: fear of the unknown, grief for the relationship I thought I had, and a burgeoning sense of empowerment. I realized that my growing independence was a double-edged sword. It gave me strength, but it also intensified the conflict with Mark. I began to understand that this tension was inevitable. Change disrupts comfort, and Mark's comfort was rooted in control. My refusal to be diminished was a challenge he was struggling to accept. Despite the escalating tension, I found solace in the small victories of self-discovery. I was learning to trust my own instincts, to honor my feelings without apology. Each step toward independence felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost. The emotional battles at home tested my resolve. Mark's increasing attempts to belittle my feelings sometimes left me shaken, but I refused to retreat into silence. I sought strength in the knowledge that I was not alone, that others had faced similar struggles and emerged stronger. I also found comfort in the friendships I was cultivating outside of my marriage. Mia's unwavering support reminded me that I deserved kindness and respect. Jake, the neighbor and handyman, offered a gentle presence that contrasted sharply with Mark's hostility. His easy smile and willingness to listen without judgment were a balm to my weary heart. Even as Mark's frustration grew, I held on to these connections, drawing strength from the knowledge that I was worthy of love and understanding. They helped me maintain my sense of self amid the storm. Navigating the escalating tension required careful balance. I learned to pick my battles, to protect my emotional well-being without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Sometimes that meant walking away from arguments or choosing silence over confrontation. Other times it meant standing firm in my boundaries, even when Mark's words stung. I discovered that self-care became essential, not just the physical acts of rest and nourishment, but the emotional work of affirming my worth and cultivating hope. I journaled, meditated, and allowed myself moments of quiet reflection in the apartment that had become my refuge. These practices helped me maintain resilience in the face of growing hostility. I began to see that my journey was not just about leaving Mark, but about reclaiming my identity and healing the wounds of neglect. The duality of my life, the tension with Mark at home and the peace I found in my apartment and friendships, was challenging to sustain. But I clung to the belief that this struggle was temporary, a necessary step toward a better future. I also began to recognize patterns in Mark's behavior that had long gone unacknowledged. His frustration was often a projection of his own insecurities and fears. Understanding this didn't excuse his actions, but helped me separate his issues from my own worth. This insight strengthened my resolve to protect myself emotionally. I reminded myself daily that I deserved respect and kindness, even when Mark's words denied it. As the weeks passed, the tension at home became almost palpable. Mark's attempts to control and belittle me escalated, but so did my determination to stand firm. I was no longer willing to shrink to fit the confines of a marriage that denied my voice. In moments of quiet, I envisioned the life I was building. The apartment filled with light, friendships blossoming, a future where I could be free. These visions sustained me, even as the present grew more difficult. I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. The escalating tension was a warning that confrontation was inevitable. But I also knew that my growing sense of self-worth and independence gave me the strength to face whatever came. Mark's frustration was a sign that the balance of power in our marriage was shifting. I was no longer the silent, compliant wife. I was becoming a woman who demanded to be seen and heard. Though fear lingered, it was tempered by hope. A hope born from the quiet strength I was discovering within myself. I was learning that empowerment often comes through struggle, and that standing up for oneself is an act of courage. The tension at home was a crucible, forging me into someone stronger, more resilient. I was learning to navigate the complexities of change, to hold space for both pain and growth. As I prepared for the next steps in my journey, I carried with me the lessons of this time. The importance of boundaries, the power of self-love, and the strength found in community. Mark's growing frustration was a challenge, but it was also a confirmation that I was moving in the right direction. Change is rarely easy, especially when it threatens the status quo. But I was ready to face the tension, to embrace the uncertainty, and to continue building the life I deserved. One where my voice mattered, and my worth was never questioned. The night I confronted Mark for the last time, every emotion I bottled up over the years surged to the surface with a force I couldn't contain. The house was heavy with tension, the air thick as if it held its breath, waiting for this moment to unfold. I knew this conversation would change everything. There was no turning back. I looked at him across the dimly lit living room. The man I had once loved, now a stranger wrapped in defensiveness and stubbornness. "Mark," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor inside. "I can't keep living like this. Your dismissiveness, your refusal to see me. It's breaking me." He scoffed, arms crossed, as if my words were a nuisance rather than a plea. "You're being dramatic again. I've told you need to toughen up. Stop playing the victim and start facing reality." His words hit me like a cold wave, but I refused to shrink. This isn't about playing the victim. It's about respect, about being heard. "I've tried, Mark. I've tried to make this work, but you keep shutting me down." He took a step closer, voice rising. "So what? You want to leave? Go ahead. You think you can just walk away from everything we built?" I felt my heart pounding, but I met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I want to leave. I want to find a life where I'm valued, where my feelings matter. I can't do that here with you." For a moment, the room was silent except for the steady rhythm of our breathing. Then he softened, a flicker of something, regret maybe, crossing his features. "I can change," he said quietly, almost pleading. "I don't want to lose you." But I had heard those words before. Empty promises wrapped in desperation. Change isn't just words, Mark. It's actions. And I've waited too long for those actions that never came. The weight of years pressed down on me. The dismissals, the blame, the loneliness. I realized then that staying meant sacrificing my own happiness, my self-worth, for the sake of a marriage that no longer nurtured me. "I've made my decision," I said firmly. "I'm leaving. Not because I don't love you, but because I need to love myself." He looked away, pain flickering in his eyes, but his pride kept him silent. I knew this was the final fracture in the fragile glass between us. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions: sadness, relief, fear, and a strange sense of liberation. I began to take concrete steps to separate our lives, quietly packing my things and finalizing plans for the apartment that had become my sanctuary. Mark oscillated between anger and sorrow. Sometimes he lashed out, blaming me for tearing the family apart. Other times he tried to reach out with tentative kindness, but I had learned to protect my heart, to hold firm to the boundaries I was setting for my own well-being. With each conversation, I reminded myself why I was doing this, not out of spite, but out of a desperate need to reclaim my voice and my dignity. I owed it to myself to break free from the cycle of neglect and dismissal. I found strength in the support of friends like Mia, whose unwavering belief in me buoyed me through the toughest moments. I also leaned on Jake, whose gentle presence was a comforting contrast to the storm I was leaving behind. Leaving was not just a physical act, it was an emotional reckoning. I mourned the loss of the marriage I had hoped for, the future that would never be. But I also embraced the promise of a new beginning, a chance to build a life where I could finally be seen and heard. As I packed the last of my belongings, I felt a mixture of sadness and empowerment. The house that once felt like a prison was now a place I was leaving behind, stepping into the unknown with courage. When the day came to say goodbye, I chose to take with me not possessions but something far more valuable: my self-respect and the family heirloom necklace my grandmother had given me. It was a symbol of strength and heritage, a reminder that I carried within me the resilience of generations before me. Mark watched silently as I left, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. I didn't look back. I knew that turning away was the first step toward healing. In the quiet of my new apartment, surrounded by the soft glow of city lights, I felt the first true sense of freedom. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it on my own terms. I was no longer the woman who silenced her pain to keep the peace. I was Emma, whole, hopeful, and free. In the quiet solitude of my new apartment, I began to rebuild not just my life but my very sense of self. The freedom I had longed for was finally within reach, yet it came with its own set of challenges, a mixture of loneliness and cautious hope. But I was determined to embrace this new chapter with open arms, ready to heal and grow. Reconnecting with old friends was one of the first steps I took toward reclaiming my happiness. Reaching out to Mia had been a lifeline in the darkest days, and now in my newfound independence, I sought to strengthen those bonds. Our conversations, once a secret solace, became a regular source of encouragement and laughter. Mia reminded me of my worth when I still struggled to see it myself, and her unwavering support helped me navigate the unfamiliar terrain of single life. Beyond Mia, I reached out to others who had drifted away over the years, friends whose absence had left empty spaces in my world. Some responded with warmth and surprise, their own lives altered by time and circumstance. We slowly rekindled connections, sharing stories and rediscovering the joy of genuine companionship. It was a revelation to realize how much I had missed having a circle of friends who truly saw me. Among the new faces in my life was Lily, a neighbor who lived just down the hall. Lily was the kind of person whose kindness felt effortless, a gentle presence that seemed to understand without needing words. We met by chance one afternoon when I struggled with a heavy box of groceries, and she appeared with a smile and a helping hand. From that moment, a friendship blossomed, rooted in shared experiences and mutual support. Lily had her own story of struggle and resilience, and our conversations often turned to the challenges of finding oneself after loss or hardship. Her empathy was a balm to my weary heart, and her encouragement helped me confront the lingering fears I carried from my past. With her by my side, I felt less alone in the journey toward healing. Embracing this new community also meant learning to trust again. Not just others but myself. The years of emotional neglect had left scars, and moments of doubt and insecurity still surfaced unexpectedly. Some nights, the silence of my apartment was deafening, and I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But those moments passed, replaced by the steady rhythm of self-discovery. I found solace in small rituals that nurtured my soul, morning walks in the park, journaling my thoughts, and creating art that expressed the emotions I struggled to voice. These practices became anchors, grounding me in the present and reminding me of my resilience. As I healed, I began to explore new interests and passions that had lain dormant. I enrolled in a pottery class, something I had always wanted to try but never had the courage to pursue. The tactile experience of shaping clay was both therapeutic and empowering, a metaphor for the life I was molding with my own hands. Socially, I took cautious steps, attending gatherings and meeting new people. The prospect of forming new relationships was both exciting and intimidating. I was learning to set boundaries, to recognize what felt safe and nurturing, and to protect my emotional well-being. Through it all, I remained mindful of the lessons from my past. I knew the importance of valuing myself and refusing to settle for anything less than respect and kindness. This awareness shaped how I engaged with others and what I allowed into my life. The necklace my grandmother had given me, a family heirloom I carried as a symbol of strength, became a treasured talisman. Wearing it reminded me daily of the legacy of resilience I inherited and the possibility of growth despite adversity. In moments of quiet reflection, I acknowledged both the pain I had endured and the courage it took to move forward. The process of healing was neither linear nor easy, but it was real and deeply personal. Though I sometimes felt the sting of loneliness, it was tempered by the knowledge that I was building a life rooted in authenticity and self-respect. Each new connection, each act of self-care was a step toward wholeness. I also found unexpected joy in solitude, discovering that being alone did not mean being lonely. It was a time to listen to my own voice, to nurture my dreams, and to embrace the freedom to chart my own course. As I settled into this new rhythm, I felt a growing sense of belonging, not just to a physical place but to a community and most importantly to myself. The friendships I cultivated and the healing I embraced were weaving a tapestry of hope and renewal. The journey was far from over. Healing required patience, compassion, and courage. But with each passing day, I felt more equipped to face the future. Not as a woman defined by her past, but as one empowered by her own strength. In this new chapter, I was learning to trust the process of life, to embrace its uncertainties and to cherish its possibilities. The road ahead was open, and I was ready to walk it with an open heart and a resilient spirit. The morning I left, I didn't pack much. No heavy suitcases stuffed with belongings or tokens of the life Mark and I had shared. Instead, I gathered the few things that truly mattered. A small bag of essentials, a few photographs tucked into a worn envelope, and the family heirloom necklace my grandmother had given me years ago. It was a simple gold chain with a delicate pendant, a symbol of strength and heritage that had been passed down through generations of women who had faced their own battles and emerged stronger. As I fastened the necklace around my neck, I felt a surge of courage and connection to those who had come before me. This necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a talisman of resilience, a reminder that I carried within me the strength of my ancestors. It was the one thing Mark never expected me to take: my self-respect, my history, and my hope wrapped into a small shining symbol. The house was quiet, imbued with the ghosts of memories that no longer belonged to me. I moved through the rooms with a strange mix of sadness and relief, touching surfaces that had witnessed both love and neglect. I didn't let myself linger. There was no need to look back when every step forward was an act of reclaiming my life. Mark was nowhere to be found when I left. I made sure of that. I didn't want one last argument, one final attempt to sway me with promises or guilt. I was done with empty words. This departure was mine alone. A declaration that I was choosing myself, my dignity, and my future. Walking out the front door, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. The air outside was crisp and fresh, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. I breathed deeply, savoring the sensation of freedom that had seemed so distant for far too long. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't look back. The past was a chapter one was leaving behind, and the future was an open book waiting to be written. The necklace resting against my heart was a beacon, guiding me toward healing and hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments, learning to live on my own terms, navigating the unfamiliar terrain of independence. There were moments of doubt and loneliness, but also moments of exhilaration and discovery. I was no longer defined by a marriage that had silenced me. I was becoming the author of my own story. Friends like Mia and Lily became pillars of support, their presence a steady reminder that I was not alone. Their encouragement helped me face the challenges ahead with courage and grace. And Jake, the neighbor whose kindness had been a quiet comfort, became a symbol of the new connections waiting to be forged. In the quiet evenings, I often touched the necklace, feeling its reassuring weight against my skin. It reminded me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising each time we do, about carrying forward the lessons and love that shape us. Leaving Mark was not the end but a beginning. A chance to build a life rooted in self-respect, authenticity, and hope. I was stepping into the unknown, but I did so with the knowledge that I was worthy of happiness and belonging. The necklace was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a testament to my journey, a silent witness to the pain endured, the courage summoned, and the freedom embraced. It carried the legacy of the women who came before me, and the promise of the woman I was becoming. As I settled into my new life, I understood that leaving was not just about physical distance, but about reclaiming my voice and my power. It was about choosing myself in a world that had tried to convince me otherwise. The decision to leave was the most difficult and most necessary act of love I had ever made. Love for myself, for my healing, and for the possibility of joy that awaited beyond the shadows of my past. With each step forward, I carried the necklace and its meaning close to my heart, a symbol of resilience and hope that would guide me through the uncertainties ahead. I was no longer defined by the pain of my past but by the strength I had found in breaking free. And as I embraced this new chapter, I knew I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, stronger, wiser, and free. Settling into my new life, I felt a freedom I had never known before. An open expanse of possibility stretching out before me, unshaped and inviting. The apartment, once just a quiet refuge, had become my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe, dream, and rebuild. Each morning as the sunlight filtered through the curtains, I was reminded that this was my space, my future, and my choice. The journey from silenced victim to empowered woman had been neither swift nor easy. There were days when the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on my chest, moments when loneliness crept in to shadow my newfound hope. But with every challenge I found deeper wells of resilience within myself, a growing conviction that I was worthy of happiness and respect. I began to embrace the unknown with a mixture of curiosity and courage, letting go of the need to control every outcome. The past, with all its pain and broken promises, was no longer a chain but a lesson, a foundation upon which I could build a life true to who I was becoming. My relationships flourished in this fertile ground of self-discovery. Mia remained a steadfast friend, her unwavering support a constant reminder that I was not alone. Lily's gentle kindness continued to nurture my healing, and Jake's friendship blossomed into something warm and genuine, a connection grounded in mutual respect and understanding. Together, these relationships reminded me that belonging is not just about proximity, but about being seen, heard, and valued. I was learning to cultivate these bonds with intention, choosing people who lifted me up rather than weighed me down. With each passing day, I grew more confident in my voice, more assured in my choices. I pursued passions I had once shelved, exploring new interests and rediscovering old joys. The act of creating, whether through writing, art, or simply making space for my thoughts, became a vital part of my healing. I reflected often on the necklace my grandmother had given me, the family heirloom that had accompanied me through the darkest and brightest moments of this journey. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of strength, resilience, and the enduring power of heritage. Wearing it, I felt connected to the lineage of women who had faced their own battles and emerged whole. The freedom I embraced was not without its uncertainties. Life was unpredictable, and the future remained unwritten. But I faced it with a heart open to possibility, ready to meet whatever came with grace and strength. In this space, I finally understood that happiness is not a destination but a practice, a daily choice to honor oneself, to seek connection, and to nurture hope. I was no longer defined by the shadows of my past, but illuminated by the light I cultivated within. As I sat by the window one evening, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from silence to voice, from captivity to freedom, had transformed me in ways I never imagined possible. I was Emma, a woman reborn through struggle and courage, ready to embrace the uncertainties of her new life with open arms. The future was mine to shape, a canvas waiting for the colors of my choosing. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what I could create.